Hey, welcome back to the show, MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I am super excited because today is episode 100 of the MetFlex and Chill podcast, which is absolutely crazy to me. I can't believe we've already hit 100 episodes. Time is flying by. I'm very, very thankful for all of you for listening over these past 100 episodes. It's been about a year now since the podcast went live, and I hope that I've been able to bring you some value through, the guests that we've had on, answering your questions through these solo episodes, and I can't wait to continue. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and asking questions, and so today's podcast is all about protein, which is actually very fitting for the 100th episode because all of you know that I'm a huge fan of talking about all things protein. It's one of my favorite topics. And today I am actually answering one question that I got on my Instagram stories. The question, which I'll chat about in a second, but basically it's asking how to choose the best protein sources, right? And so I decided to turn this one question into an entire podcast because obviously I love protein, I love talking about it, and I think there's a few different ways that you can go about determining the best sources of protein, and a few questions that you can actually ask yourself that will help you to determine, what a quality source is, how much of that source you need, all that jazz. So we'll dive into that in a second. Before we do, big shout out to our sponsor for this month, Ketobrick and Livesavage Apparel. Ketobrick is a performance replacement bar, a performance bar. It's a meal replacement bar. It's a shelf-stable bar. I've chatted about it in past episodes, and if you are interested in checking it out, you can go to ketobrick.com. I'll link that in the show notes. Personally, I use Ketobrick as kind of a treat throughout the day. I talk about this all the time. I melt them down into little bite-sized pieces, and it's like a nice little sweet treat during the day. It can also obviously be used for going on, hikes or anywhere where you need some good quality nutrients to support, your energy needs. So Ketobrick is a very good option, especially if you are a low-carb athlete. If you're not, no worries. It's still a great option to get some healthy fats in. And like I said, I like to melt them down and use them as little treats because they are kind of like a little chocolate treat if you get the chocolate flavors. They have tons of flavors on their website. So I'll link that in the show notes. And then also Livesavage Apparel is the other company that's obviously all about apparel and super high quality fitness apparel. So sports bras, leggings, t-shirts, things like that. I wear this clothing all the time. Love it. So definitely check that out as well in the show notes. I will link both Ketobrick and Livesavage Apparel if you want to check them out. All right, so let's get into this episode chatting all about how to choose the best protein sources. Okay, so the question from Instagram was, can you explain the difference in the quality of protein in foods? I've noticed some nutrition content contains the number of grams of protein and a percentage, and then some do not. Okay, so great question. So when trying to understand protein quality, I think the easiest way to do it is to ask yourself a few questions. And I'm going to get into these questions in a second, but before we do, it's important to understand, what protein is actually made of and why it matters. So we know that amino acids are the building blocks of protein, right? So you need them to make the protein structures that basically build and maintain the tissues in your body. And we know that amino acids can be broken up into two main categories. These two main categories are non-essential amino acids and essential amino acids. The easiest way to remember that is just think, okay, non-essential just means that your body can make these amino acids from other substrates within your body, right? So they're non-essential to your diet versus essential amino acids, your body cannot make these, right? So it makes sense that they are essential because you need to consume them through your diet and through the protein sources that you eat. So This is why it's super important to make sure that you're getting an adequate amount of essential amino acids from your diet, and so that you actually know where to get those amino acids from. And that's why protein quality is super important, and just understanding the different proteins that are made up of different types of amino acids can go super far in making sure that you are getting these essential amino acids that you need, right? So another thing when it comes to amino acids is that a lot of people associate amino acids purely with protein synthesis and like muscle gain or muscle building, which we are going to talk about in a second and is important to that. But there's so many different ways that you use protein within your body, and it's necessary for basically every other physiological function that happens and that takes place. So things like enzyme production, hormone regulation, cognitive function, neurotransmitter balance, metabolism, all of these things. So protein is not just like a muscle building nutrient. There's so many different things that it does. So that's just something to kind of think about. Like amino acids play a huge role in all of different processes in your body, not just, when it comes to muscle building. So I'm not going to go through like every single amino acid, but it is important to know that we do have the essential amino acids and we do have non-essential amino acids, and there's different protein sources contain different amounts of these amino acids. And so that's why it's important to kind of know what your protein's made of. We are going to we're going to dive a little bit into the essential amino acids in more detail, because obviously those are very important. And BCAAs, which I'm sure you've heard about, are a subcategory of the essential amino acids. So BCAAs stand for branched chain amino acids, and these include leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So again, I'm going to chat more about those in a little bit, but this is why it's important to understand, again, what your protein is made of, because not all protein sources are created equal. Not all protein sources contain the same amino acids. And so we need to kind of understand that to be able to optimize our intake. Okay, so let's get into the top 6 questions that I would recommend asking yourself when you're trying to choose the best protein sources. So the first question is going to be, is it a complete or an incomplete protein? So foods that provide all of the essential amino acids, like we just talked about, are called complete proteins, and the foods that don't provide all of the essential amino acids are called incomplete proteins, right? So complete contains all essential amino acids, incomplete does not contain all of the essential amino acids. So complete proteins would be things like animal protein, so meat, dairy, eggs, and fish, for example. And then there are a few plant-based complete sources, which would be things like soy, quinoa, chia seeds, hemp seeds, foods like that. So generally speaking, though, animal protein provides all of the essential amino acids, like I mentioned, in the right ratio for you to make full use of them, which we're going to talk about this in the second question. So if you're eating animal products like meat, fish, eggs, dairy, all the things I just mentioned every single day, you're likely doing pretty well protein-wise and probably getting enough essential amino acids. However, if you don't eat animal foods or you eat them in smaller quantities, getting all the protein and essential amino acids that your body needs is going to be a bit more challenging. And especially if you're a vegetarian or a vegan and you consume, entirely or mainly a plant-based diet, it's important that you take into consideration the combinations of your proteins and meal selection throughout the day. This means that you'll have to combine certain incomplete plant-based protein sources with others to actually form complete proteins. And this is called what we call complementary proteins. So for example, grains and legumes are complementary proteins because when you combine them, you can technically get all of the essential amino acids. Same with nuts and seeds. Those are complementary to legumes, for example. But this is what we're going to talk about in terms of how your body processes these proteins, because it's important, right? It's important to understand that as well. Just because you can combine incomplete plant proteins to get complete proteins, it doesn't mean that these complete plant proteins become equal to animal proteins. And this is what brings me to question number 2, which is how bioavailable is this protein to my body? So it's not just about what these proteins consume in terms of their amino acid profile, but it's also relevant and important to know how these proteins are broken down in your body and how you can how you utilize them, and how beneficial they are once they kind of go through that process of digestion and absorption. So as I mentioned, all proteins contain amino acids, and each protein is made up of a different selection of these amino acids in different proportions. And when we're talking about bioavailability, protein bioavailability, whoa, that's a hard word to say. Protein bioavailability just refers to how well your body utilizes a specific type of protein. So a protein is considered to be highly bioavailable if it's easy to digest, absorb, and make into other proteins within your body once you digest and absorb them. So bioavailability is basically like a scoring system for the usability of the protein in the foods you eat. It's pretty simple, actually. And the more quickly and easily your protein source is broken down and absorbed, the higher the bioavailability score will be. So basically, again, your body can use a higher percentage of the protein you consume if it comes from sources that are easy to break down. That just makes sense. And then on the flip side, if a protein is difficult to break down, your body won't be able to use as much of it. So the bioavailability of different protein sources can actually be measured, and then they're given a score between 0 and 159. I have no idea why that is the range, 0 and 159. Seems very random, but that's the range. And so I'm going to go into that in a second. And the science behind measuring it is a little bit complex, so I'm not going to get into it. But basically, the higher the score, the easier it is to break down the protein, and the more of it will actually be utilized by your body. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the bioavailability index rating of some common protein sources. And we'll go into we'll go from the most bioavailable to the least bioavailable, depending on the scores. So if we're talking about that 0 to 159 range, whey protein, for example, like whey protein isolate blends, whey concentrate, those are going to have bioavailability index scores greater than 100. So like 100 to 159, even like the top end. So those are going to be the most absorbable and utilizable. That is not a word. The most absorbable forms of protein. Basically, your body digests it and absorbs it very, very well. So that would be whey protein isolate and whey concentrate are like the top ends of that. We're going to get into in a second, why whey protein might not be the best source for you, especially, even if it is the highest bioavailability, even if it is highest on the bioavailability index, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best source of protein. It just means that your body can utilize it pretty well and digest it pretty easily for most people, but we'll get into that in a second. So technically that's like whey protein would be the highest, and then kind of going down the line, whole eggs, cow's milk, egg whites, fish, beef, chicken, casein, those are all around 77 and above, which is really good in terms of bioavailability. And then once we get into like the plant-based sources like rice, soy, wheat, beans, and peanuts, those are on the lower end. So those all have a bioavailability index score of under 70, which just means that they're harder for our bodies to digest and absorb. So long story short, the protein you get from animals is a lot more bioavailable to your body compared to plants, even if some of these plant sources are complete, and even if you can combine incomplete plant sources to make them complete, it's not going to be equal to the quality and I guess the bioavailability of the animal proteins that you would consume. So I'm not saying that you can't utilize the protein from plant sources, but it's just not going to be as efficient as it would be from animal sources, and that's based off of the bioavailability score. And this brings me to question number 3, which is how calorie dense is this protein source for the amount that I'm getting? So most plants just honestly can't compete with animals when it comes to the amount of protein they provide. And this is because most plant protein sources are also a source of fat or carbohydrates, which makes them less protein dense and more calorie dense for the amount that you're getting. So for example, let's say a meal that contains, like a meal with beans and quinoa, which is plant-based sources of protein, that can provide, about 30 grams of protein. With that to get that 30 grams of protein from beans and quinoa, you're also going to get about 600 calories and about 100 grams of carbs, right? So it's a good chunk of calories for only 30 grams of protein. Another example is like taking peanuts, for example. So to get 30 grams of protein from peanuts, you'll have to eat about 650 calories worth of peanuts, which is about 58 grams of fat. So compare this to 30 grams of protein from an animal source like a sirloin steak, for example, chicken breast, or another lean animal protein source. It's generally going to be less than 200 calories for that amount, for that 30 grams. And it's going to contain minimal fat and pretty much zero carbohydrates. So that's just something to think about, right? Like, how calorie dense is this protein source for the amount that I am getting from that? So can I eat 200 calories worth of meat that gives me 30 grams of protein? Or do I eat 600 calories worth of plant-based protein that, yes, it will give me 30 grams of protein, but we know it's not going to be as bioavailable to the body, and we know we're getting triple the amount of calories for that source. So again, something to think about, right? So let's see. Number 4 would be, how many nutrients am I getting from this protein source? So that's the fourth question I would ask. This also goes back to kind of distinguishing between or chatting about plant versus animal protein. So a lot of plants we know contain high amounts of fiber, vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats, coconuts, avocados, things like that. So they are a good source of, obviously, nutrition outside of just protein. However, they do lack certain vitamins, right? So like, for example, vitamin B12, which we can only find in most animal sources, and also things like zinc and omega-3s. So this is kind of important to think about too, like, how many nutrients am I getting for the protein source that I'm consuming? Because we know that nutrients are obviously important, micronutrients are important, and we are kind of, I grew up learning that all of my micronutrients and all of my, nutrients are coming from plants and, or like fruits and vegetables, right? Like, you grew up thinking, oh, like, if I want to get all my nutrients, I have to eat my fruits and vegetables. That's not untrue, but it's a little bit oversimplified, I guess you could say, especially when we're looking at the actual nutrient density of different foods. So yes, fruits and vegetables contain micronutrients. We know that. But when we're going back to bioavailability, you need to think about, okay, how much of those nutrients, even if they are coming from, fruits and vegetables, how much am I actually absorbing, right? Versus if I were to consume nutrient-dense animal products that contain lots of micronutrients as well that we don't even think about because they're just not mainstream. Things like beef liver and organ meats, like those all are jam-packed with tons of micronutrients that are not only higher than a lot of the micronutrients, like a lot of the comparisons, like in terms of vitamins and minerals that you would get compared to like fruits and vegetables. Not only is it higher in things like organ meats and even beef, it's also way more bioavailable to your body. So you're going to be able to absorb the nutrients from those sources a lot easier. So again, this is just something to kind of think about. It's not as simple as, oh, like we see, blueberries and kale. Yes, they have nutrients, right? And they're good sources of certain micronutrients, but it doesn't mean that they are the only sources of those micronutrients. And when we actually compare them on like a chart, say, for example, like comparing blueberries to kale to beef to beef liver, like you can just see, I'm actually looking at a chart right now. I'm not going to list out all of the numbers here, but you can just see that there's differences in the amount that these contain per the certain amount that you would consume and per the amount that would be bioavailable to your body. So for just a quick example, like if we're taking beef liver compared to kale, right? A lot of people think, kale is super healthy, like it has lots of micronutrients, blah, blah, blah. But when we're comparing gram for gram beef liver to kale, you're actually getting, let's see, thinking about, I'm just trying to pick a nutrient that a lot of people think kale has more of versus, beef. So let's say vitamin C, for example, right? A lot of people think that you can't get a lot of vitamin C from animal sources. But if we're looking at what the actual data shows is that for 100 grams of kale, it's 41 milligrams of vitamin C versus 100 grams of beef liver is actually 27 milligrams of vitamin C. So yes, that's a little bit lower, but your body is going to be able to absorb those 27 milligrams of vitamin C from that beef liver probably a lot better than it is from the kale, just because we know what we just talked about bioavailability. And then when we're also looking at other nutrients, so let's look at like iron, for example. Iron is way higher in obviously animal-based sources than it is in plant-based sources. There's a whole list of things. So like folate, for example, you're getting 145 micrograms of folate from beef liver compared to 13 micrograms from kale. What else do we have here? There's just tons. I'm not going to read them all off, but if you just do a Google search of like comparison of the nutrient density within like plant versus organ meat, then you're going to that'll give you kind of a breakdown of all of it. And I'll link something in the show notes. I'll link a chart in the show notes. Actually, I'll link the one that I'm looking at right now so you can go check that out yourself. But all in all, I'm rambling on here. Just kind of think about it's not as simple as, fruits and vegetables have lots of nutrients, so that's where I'm getting all my nutrients from or all my micronutrients from. It's not as simple as that, especially when we're talking about bioavailability and especially when we're talking about actually looking at the numbers and the breakdown of these certain foods. So hopefully that makes sense. And then getting into question number 5, does the protein come from a whole food quality source? So this question, we can actually chat about a few subcategories or a few sub-questions. And the first one would be, whole versus processed protein sources, right? So when we're talking whole foods, think like, steak, chicken, things like that, versus a processed protein or like a protein supplement would be what I would consider processed or like a protein powder. So for this, is it a whole versus a processed protein? So is it steak versus protein powder, for example? So we do have some advantages and disadvantages, or some advantages to some versus the other. So when we're talking about whole food advantages, this goes back to that nutrient density side of things. So the more whole food it is, the closer to nature it is. I always say, if it had a face at some point or grew from the earth at some point, it is closer to nature, right? So the nutrient density of that whole food is going to be much more than it would be from a supplement or a processed protein. So it's going to have just more of a complete nutrient profile and typically have more micronutrients. It's also going to digest slower than processed protein sources. It's going to have a higher thermic effect of food, which means that the energy it takes to break down that whole food protein source is probably going to be higher than the energy it would take to break down its processed counterpart. And for some people, it's going to have a greater satiety rate, or greater satiety effect, when you're consuming 8 ounces of chicken breast versus 2 scoops of whey protein. Typically if you're drinking 2 scoops of whey protein versus 8 ounces of chicken breast, typically you're going to have a greater satiety value from that chicken breast. But it's not saying that supplements or supplemental protein is bad or anything like that. We're just kind of comparing the two, right? So there's some advantages to supplemental protein. The first thing is super convenient, right? That's obviously one advantage. And it's useful if you're trying to, if you struggle hitting your protein goal throughout the day. And then we also know, we chatted about a few questions ago about bioavailability. We know whey is super bioavailable to your body. So it is a good source of protein. Obviously, some people can be more sensitive to whey protein powders than others. I think that also is a misconception in the fact that a lot of protein powders are actually low quality. So if you get a high quality protein powder, like a high quality whey protein powder, sometimes, and I've seen this for myself and for my clients, a lot of the issues like that you would get from consuming whey protein actually go away because you're actually consuming a high quality source that doesn't contain tons of other fillers and crap that would actually be what is causing the upset, I guess you could say. And then also if you are sensitive to like dairy, for example, protein powders like casein might give you a little bit of issues. Whey concentrate might give you a little issues, but whey isolate could be a good option because it basically doesn't have any of that lactose in it. So if you are sensitive to lactose, then like a whey isolate would be probably a better choice, a high quality whey isolate. Anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole now. But anyway, we want to think about, is it a whole versus a processed protein source, and what are the advantages of consuming one versus the other, which I just chatted about. When it comes to kind of looking at your overall day and consuming whole protein sources versus supplements, I like to use the 90-10 rule. This just means like when we look at your overall protein for the day, is 90% coming from whole foods, like whole animal-based foods, versus like 10% can come from maybe protein powders or like a protein bar. So that's how I like to look at it. That's how I look at it with my clients. We kind of use this 90-10 rule. If we look at their overall food intake for the day, I would like to see, I would say at least, 80 to 90% whole food protein. So coming from, an animal source like meat, fish, eggs, dairy, things like that, versus like protein powders and protein bars. Those could fit into your day, but I wouldn't make them the majority of your day. And then also if we're talking about the different types of protein powders and comparing them, I actually did a full episode with Shawn where we broke all of these down into great detail. So definitely check that out. It's episode 43 and it's titled All Things Protein with Shawn Wells. I will link that in the show notes. So the second kind of sub question within the whole food quality source question, which is the main question, which was, does the protein come from a whole food quality source? So the first kind of subcategory was, okay, let's compare whole versus processed. Now let's talk about conventional versus grass-fed versus grass-finished. So when we're talking about grass-fed or like 100% grass-fed, grass-finished versus conventional beef, there's obviously differences here. When we're looking at like the environment, like comparing the environment. So we know that cattle that are 100% grass fed are free range. They, spend their entire life on pastures. They're not in feedlots or factories, versus conventional meats are usually grain-fed cattle that might start their lives on, a pasture, but then they're later confined to feedlots. With diets, like their diet, the grass-fed, obviously grass-fed beef, are going to have a diet that is mostly grass. And the conventional beef will be, the diet of the conventional cattle will be mostly it's like processed grains, corn, soy, things like that, which obviously is not, like the typical, it's not the typical diet that you would want for an animal, or that's not their diet that they evolved on, right? So those are just some things to think about. Then also like the nutrition wise, if we're looking at the nutrition and the nutrients within the grass-fed versus conventional, there's going to be some differences there. And then also in terms of like hormones and antibiotics, the grass-finished, grass-fed are not going to be given any hormones or antibiotics, versus the conventional are going to have routinely given antibiotics to prevent like the spread of diseases and infections that would come from being in those feedlots. So that's just kind of a comparison between grass-fed, grass-finished, and conventional. There is a little bit of kind of confusion when it comes to the differences between like 100% grass-fed and then just grass-fed when we're talking about labels. I don't want to get into that in this episode because I'm already rambling on enough, but you can kind of Google that. Like, just if you're interested, just Google like what's the difference between 100% grass-fed, just grass-fed, and then obviously conventional, and it'll get like charts that give you all the differences. So obviously grass-fed and finished sources are going to be higher quality just based on everything I mentioned. So if you can afford getting those, like if you can afford 100% grass-fed, grass-finished beef, then I would say that's probably going to be more advantageous for you. But with all that being said, there's nothing wrong with buying conventional meat, like if that's what's in your budget and that's all you can afford. I would much rather see somebody buy conventional beef and eat, a good source of protein, because you're still going to get a good source of protein from that. You're still going to get nutrients from the conventional meats. Again, obviously it's not going to be as high quality, but it'll still be quality. So just some things to think about again. And then lastly, within this question, kind of talking about wild caught versus farm raised when it comes to seafood. The most common example is just talking through like salmon, for example, like farm raised salmon versus wild caught salmon. When we're distinguishing between the two, farm raised salmon usually has like the pink color that you see in salmon. It's actually added to it. So they like literally inject the salmon with like this pink orange color to make it brighter, which is just, I don't know. I just think that's unnecessary, but that's what they do. Farm salmon's going to have a higher fat content than wild caught salmon. It's also probably going to be exposed to more toxins and contaminants. Usually farm raised salmon, and I'm using salmon as an example, but this can be for, other seafood sources as well. Usually it's going to have more omega-6 fatty acids than wild caught, which would have more omega-3s. And we know that omega-3s are very, very important. And we know that in America, most people have a super high ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s when we would want that ratio to be more balanced. So that's why obviously omega-3s are important to your diet. They're important for brain development, for overall health. So that's where farm versus wild would be probably not as advantageous. And then also farm raised salmon, for example, is fed like corn and grains, just like beef in the feedlots, which, that's not a typical diet for salmon, is eating corn and grains. So those are just some things to think about. Again, I think it comes back to, what you can afford. And, when we're talking about we're talking about calories too, like caloric density of seafood. For example, farm-raised salmon versus wild-caught salmon is going to have a great amount of calories for what you're getting, because obviously it has a higher fat content versus the wild-caught. So that's also something to think about. But yeah, those are just, a few questions to ask yourself when it comes to quality and sources of protein, especially when we're looking at like beef versus, seafood and things like that. So that would be question number 5 is, does the protein come from a whole food quality source? And then is it a whole versus processed protein source? Is it conventional versus grass-fed, or is it wild-caught versus farm-raised? So that's number 5. And then number 6 is, how much leucine does it have? So again, many but not all plant-based proteins are low in various amino acids, especially the amino acids that we mentioned in the beginning, which are essential to our diet, right? And so a lot of plant-based sources are very low in the essential amino acid leucine, which I've talked about several times on the podcast, but leucine plays a major role in building muscle and repairing muscle tissue. So leucine is essentially like you can call it kind of like the trigger for muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis is just basically the process that your body uses to repair, grow, and strengthen muscle fibers. So even though you may have, like, for example, consuming lots of protein, even if it's coming, from plant sources, and even if it's complete plant sources, even if you have a good amount of amino acids like circulating in your bloodstream, you need a bolus of leucine, which would be around a 25 gram or more dose of protein, which typically will contain about 2.5 grams of leucine if it's a quality animal-based protein source. You need a bolus of leucine to actually trigger or stimulate muscle protein synthesis, right? So it's kind of like, I like to think of it as a light switch. And it's not necessarily like leucine is the only thing you need. You actually need leucine in combination with the other essential amino acids and in combination with the other amino acids. But if you don't have enough leucine, you're not going to get that kind of trigger or that switch for muscle protein synthesis. So most people, the threshold can be hit by consuming about 20 to 40 grams of high quality animal-based protein. That's around where you'll see about 2.5 grams of leucine, which we see as kind of like that minimal amount that we need to trigger muscle protein synthesis. You can usually get that from about 40 grams of high quality animal-based protein. Also realize that this threshold, right, this muscle protein synthesis light switch threshold thing, it goes up as we age, because as we age, muscle breakdown goes up. Right? So this threshold will continue to increase as you age, which just means that you need to be consuming high quality sources of protein and even potentially more protein than you would when you were younger. Again, another reason why protein is just so important. So just something to think about. And then lastly, in this is the last question that I would ask, how much leucine does it have? I want to chat a little bit about whey versus collagen, in the sense of, what the amino acid profiles of whey and collagen are, because this is something that's very confusing to a lot of people. And, it's something that you do need to understand, especially if you are consuming collagen in your diet, or if you've replaced maybe some of the replace some of the protein that you consume with collagen. Realize that it's not actually created equal to all animal sources of protein. And the reason is because collagen is generally rich in certain amino acids like glycine, arginine, and proline, for example, but it's not rich in some of the other essential amino acids, especially leucine and the other BCAAs that we know are important for specifically like muscle growth and repair. So the reason why collagen can be a good source of protein for specific reasons is because, unlike our ancestors who were consuming nose to tail animal foods, most of us are probably slightly deficient in the amino acids that do come from collagen-rich foods, specifically what I mentioned, glycine. And this is important because collagen does support our connective tissue and like collagen-based structures in our body. So things like our ligaments, tendons, cartilage, hair, skin, and nails. Collagen is important for that, right? So if you're not consuming collagen-rich foods on a daily basis, things like real bone broth, fish like sardines and mackerel, which contain, which you can actually eat the bones, right? Which will contain a good amount of collagen and connective tissue that's important for those processes in your body to be able to kind of optimize, the support of your ligaments, tendon, hair, skin, and nails, things like that. Supplementing with collagen can be beneficial, right? Because most people aren't eating nose to tail. But like I said, collagen is not a replacement for, say, some of the animal protein that you might be consuming throughout the day. So the thing to just realize is that, like, for example, if you are someone who was consuming whey protein powder as like 30 grams of your protein throughout the day, and you switch that protein from whey to collagen, you're not going to be getting the same amino acids that you need, specifically if your goal is, for example, to build muscle or muscle repair and things like that. So if you are consuming protein powder as a source of your daily protein intake, you have to be aware of what the protein powder actually contains amino acid wise, right? So again, collagen is going to contain more of the amino acid glycine, which is not actually very high in like animal-based proteins in terms of, is not very high in animal muscle, like muscle meat, right? Versus methionine and the BCAAs and essential amino acids, those are going to be higher in the muscle meat of the animal versus collagen. So hopefully that makes sense. And I just wanted to, I know I went off on a tangent there, but that's just kind of thinking about like whey versus collagen and realizing that not all protein powders are created equal, and just knowing like the amino acid profile of those protein powders can actually like make it make a lot more sense in terms of, you know, what you're consuming, why you're consuming it, and what specific goal like you're using it for, right? So collagen would be more so for like repair of ligaments and, you know, your hair, skin, nails, and optimizing that, versus whey would be more so like building muscle and protein synthesis and protein repair as well. So, or muscle repair as well. So just things to think about. And then lastly, I know this episode is already super long and I'm rambling on, but I do want to just quickly chat about this is another question that I got, but kind of part of this initial question, which was, what does grams of protein really mean? So this is a very common misunderstanding. We need to realize that in nutrition science, grams of protein refers to how many grams of the macronutrient protein is in a certain food, not the weighted grams of that food. So this can be where protein intake gets a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with the grams of protein in the food versus the weighted measurement in grams. So for example, an 8-ounce serving of beef will weigh 226 grams, but it only contains about 60 grams of actual protein. Another example, a large egg weighs about 46 grams, but it only contains 6 grams of protein. So just don't get confused with the weight of the food versus the composition of the food, because that's something that I think a lot of people, when it comes to protein, get confused about. And this is why when I'm chatting with clients about tracking the weight of their protein, I always like to use ounces instead of grams, because it just helps minimize the confusion. So if we're talking about, you know, how much protein did you eat today? Okay, I ate an 8-ounce serving of steak. And I know that that's about 60 grams of protein, versus using like the weighted measurements, versus using the weighted measurement of grams, which it just gets confusing. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense and clears up kind of the grams confusion that tends to come with protein measurements. Okay, that was a super long episode. So in conclusion, the 6 questions that I would recommend asking yourself when you're trying to figure out the best protein sources. The first one is going to be, is it a complete or an incomplete protein? How bioavailable is this protein to my body? How calorie dense is this protein source for the amount I'm getting? How many nutrients am I getting from this source of protein? Does the protein come from a whole food quality source? And how much leucine does it have? So those are the top 6 questions that I recommend paying attention to when we're looking at protein sources and protein quality and all of that. Hopefully this helps. And another quick shout out to our sponsor for today's episode and for this month's podcast, Ketobrick and Livesavage Apparel. If you're interested in checking them out, I linked both of the websites in the description, so you can check those out. And as always, thank you so much for listening. I can't believe we've already had 100 episodes. I'm excited to continue recording episodes and growing the show. And if there's anything else I can do to help you or make this show more valuable to you, please definitely reach out. You can contact me through my website, metflexlife.com, or just message me on Instagram at rachelgregory.cns. All right, I'll chat with you next time.